Welcome back. Let's get reaction to my in-depth and exclusive interview with Rudy Giuliani from our own all-star panel. A role reversal for a special report anchor and chief political anchor Bret Baier in New York tonight. He's the author of the huge new, yes, soon-to-be bestseller, New York Times, 3 Days in Moscow, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of the Soviet Empire. And in Raleigh, former Whitewater Deputy Independent Counsel Saul Weisenberg. Gentlemen, great to see both of you. Saul, let's start with you. What did you take away from that interview with Rudy?
Well, I look at everything like this kind of an interview, at the performance level and the substantive level. At the performance level, I think he did a very good job. This is what he should have done from the very beginning when he was on Sean's show. He was much more polished. He knew much more. So that was very good. Many of his statements were incorrect, and some of them were preposterous, and some of them were just arguments and opinions. But there's no way that the person under investigation or his attorney gets to say it's been a year, that's too much. But again, in terms of performance, I thought he did pretty well.
Let's play the first soundbite, guys, from this interview, which is the question of whether the president himself can be indicted. Let's watch.
The same reason they can't indict him, they can't issue a subpoena to him. And remember, Clinton opposed a subpoena, and then he voluntarily complied. He didn't give up presidential prerogative, and then his administration wrote a memo saying they can't do that.
Brett, I want to go to you on this. Saul, I'll go to you in a second. But Brett, it's interesting. Judge Andrew Napolitano made a point earlier today, and he said, when Mueller supposedly said, Mueller's team said, we're not going to indict the president because we're going to stand by this, this Justice Department advisory opinion that you can't indict a sitting president. What Napolitano said, that this was a 1999 advisory opinion. It wasn't binding. So if Mueller wanted to change his approach on that, he could, which I found interesting.
Yeah, and I thought that was a fascinating part of the interview. I think, Rudy is hanging on to that the team may have told him that about the indictment and staying to the guidelines from back in the Clinton years. However, his answers suggested that they're getting ready for a fight over a possible subpoena, and whether that's legitimate and how they could fight that if they don't want the president to sit down under the guidelines that they set up.
And Saul, you heard him at the end. Let them put on the table what they have. Will we agree or not, disagree whether the grounds are legitimate or illegitimate? We don't think they're legitimate. We're going to take them to court on these issues. And he said, we'll rip it apart and we'll rip them apart. That's kind of like one-upsmanship on the threats game. But you're right, on performance that was good. But what about the substance of that point that he made on the subpoena?
Oh, he's completely wrong. I mean, the first subpoena issued and served on a president was by John Marshall on Thomas Jefferson in 1807. There was a subpoena served on Madison, and of course we all know about the subpoena served on President Nixon by Leon Jaworski, and the Supreme Court ruled 8-0 that the president had to obey it. Now, so he's utterly, completely wrong. And the OLC opinion, to my knowledge, only talks about whether or not you can indict a president. By the way, President Clinton didn't fight the subpoena from Judge Starr. He asked us to withdraw it and said he would come if we did, and that's what happened. We don't know if he would have fought it. I don't think he would have fought it. Now, if he is subpoenaed and invokes executive privilege, that is President Trump, and a court rules against him, he can say, like Andrew Jackson supposedly said, you've made your law, Chief Justice Marshall, now see if you can enforce it. And then the Supreme Court has said twice that orders have to be obeyed in Cooper versus Aaron and in U.S. versus Nixon. But he could say, that's interesting, I'm the president, I'm a co-equal branch, and I'm not going to do it. And then we'd have a really interesting constitutional crisis on our hands.
Brett, the part of the interview where I brought up the issue of staffers, because we know the special counsel has brought in a number of the close staff, former staff of the President of the United States, and this is how the discussion went. Let's watch. Are you concerned about any of the former Trump White House staffers? I know Hope Hicks, her name was thrown around in working with Don Jr., maybe on the statement about the Trump Tower meeting. Are you worried about her conversations at all with the special counsel?
God, that would be really cheap.
But he's turning the screws on people.
If they did that to her, then a Justice Department would have to step in and act, because it would be just total injustice.
Brett.
Yeah, but listen, you have Jim Comey, who told me that he didn't know what this whole thing about Michael Flynn was, but lawmakers saying that he told them that the FBI agents didn't believe that Michael Flynn was lying. Yet the screws were put onto Michael Flynn, and he eventually pled guilty, and it moved forward. So you can imagine the screws being put potentially to a lot of these other staffers who've done interviews. I think the politics of this is really interesting. I can see the comfort that perhaps President Trump has in Rudy Giuliani being a fighter for him. And they may have more ammo very soon, as this IG report is expected to come out very soon. And Michael Horowitz may have a lot of details that we have yet to really have been revealed.
Now, Brett, on a slightly different topic, your book, 3 Days Over Moscow, the president, President Reagan, for whom I used to work all those years ago, he goes over to Moscow in 1988. He gives a speech at Moscow State University. Let's think about Korea, whether this summit will happen or not happen. I wonder if there'll be a day, it would be great, if we could have President Trump go to North Korea or a unified Korea and speak to a mixed group of students from both the North and the South. Yeah. I mean, think about how wild that would be. No one thought probably it was possible for Reagan to go to Moscow, as you write about in your book.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, it was something that was only dreamed about. And here's a president who was talking about anti-communist feelings and thoughts for a long time, even back when he was Screen Actors Guild president in Hollywood. And here he was standing delivering this speech in the heart of communism in Moscow. I think it's possible. I think that this is touch and go with this June 12th Singapore summit because this is the North Koreans, as you said at the beginning. It's part of laying the groundwork for what they're trying to get done.
Gentlemen, thanks so much.